Hi everyone, welcome to Real Talk on Racism. I'm your host, Russ Terry, and I'm super excited and grateful to be here with you today. We have an excellent guest. My good friend, Kenrick Ross is here. Kenrick, welcome to Real Talk on Racism.
Thank you, Russ. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. So let me ask you off the top, why is this topic, anti-racism, so important to you?
Beyond the fact that it's like what I do, right? It's work for me. But I always say to people, my entire existence would not have been for the work of other people. And like now we call that anti-racism. Before we call that anti-discrimination, civil rights, protests, whatever we have called it over generations. But people have gone out of their way to make change for people like me. So I can be a immigrant, gay man living a fully authentic life, as much as I can in this society. And I don't know if they necessarily dreamt of me being the beneficiary of what they did.
You said a second ago, people like me. What is your cultural background?
So I would say I am a Caribbean man, or a Caribbean man, if you want to do the whole Caribbean accent. So I define myself as, in the American context, I would be other, mixed, African American sometimes, Asian American, Pacific Islander. Which is to say that various ancestors of mine from Europe, South Asia, and Africa made their way against their will or to seek fortune to the Caribbean coast of South America, and generations later, I am here.
Got it. So you're mixed race, is
Yes.
that right? Okay, which I would imagine has a number of effects and is relevant in many ways as you navigate life, is that right?
Absolutely. So the United States is a very binary culture, as we know. It's literally it's been written into American law that if you are not white, then you are by default black. And that binary has never been true in the United States as a society, right? There's always been indigenous people. There have always been API folks, particularly in the West Coast. There have always been mixed race people. But legally, the one-drop rule and things like that has made the United States a binary society. So navigating right now is, I wouldn't say it's difficult, but it's interesting because the question always comes up, what are you? And it's very important for people to ask that question respectfully. And I think it is important to explain that mixed race people or people of multiple backgrounds are part of American society, have always been part of American society, no matter what the Supreme Court has said.
So please tell me, is asking what's your cultural background a good way to ask that question, or could I ask that question better?
I think that's a good way of asking it.
And I would want you to tell me if it wasn't.
No, I think that's a good way of asking it. And I do understand why people are very sensitive. And sometimes I'm very sensitive. A terrible way of asking this is, where are you from? Particularly Asian Pacific Islander folks get this all the time. Even if their families have been in the United States for 5 generations, people will say, well, yes, you were born in, California, but where really are you from? And I've seen this play out in real time where somebody goes, California, but California. And so that's a terrible way of asking it. But asking about somebody's cultural background, part of what we need to do, and I know this is controversial at times because white ethnic studies has been controversial, but we also need to deconstruct whiteness to its ethnic origins in the United States. I went to Catholic school, high school, and people were Italian and Irish and Ukrainian. And this was the last of the white ethnics in Jersey City in a way because they were Catholic. And I think we have to ask everybody that question. What is your cultural background? What is your ancestry? And except for indigenous people, there's a history and a legacy there.
That's a good point, because if if we as a society just ask people who look like they may not be white,
Yes.
then that in and of itself may be racist because, as a white person, I could ask a fellow white person, what's your cultural background or your
Yes.
ancestry, because they might be Irish, they might be Italian, they might be Ukrainian,
Yes.
as you said.
Exactly. And once not only do you remove whiteness as the default of what American is, and then everybody else came from somewhere else, as if we don't have the Pilgrim story of people coming, you also have people understand what origins are and how othering has happened. So in the history of many white people in the United States, there is an understanding of othering, right? There is an understanding of how the Irish became white in America, how the Italians became white in America. And I think we also need to uncover that to get rid of this default that white people are always white and white people are always American.
Yeah, and this concept of other, I remember at my corporate job, you couldn't even check other as a diversity category. And there are so many people who are multi-ethnic, who
Yes.
are from multiple cultural
Yes.
backgrounds. And the fact, I can't empathize, but the fact that some huge companies can't even let you choose that when you apply for a job there, or, otherwise when you fill out your, forms when you're starting the job, I can't even imagine what that would be like for a multicultural person like you and so many others.
It's difficult. It's difficult. It's limiting. And when you're also from a background that doesn't have a binary, it's a weird thing. So, I always say that Nicki Minaj is a black woman in the United States, but she's what we call Dogla in the Caribbean. It's
Dogla?
Dogla.
What's that mean?
It's mixed race, black and Indian. So in the United States, she travels to New York and she becomes a black woman because in American constructs, there's only black and white. In the Caribbean, she belongs to a different identity. And it's not to say that those identities are less problematic. Many identities are problematic, even if you stretch them out. But there is greater room for complexity.
So you said a second ago doesn't have a binary, and even for somebody like me who is an expert, if you will, on diversity and anti-racism, I don't know exactly what that means. So what does that mean if somebody doesn't have a binary?
I think of it this way, that we have legally in the United States, because of Jim Crow, there was a legal binary on race, a white and black. Our entire history has been based on a binary politics of North and South. If you want to go into sexuality, it's straight and gay. So when I say beyond the binary, or how do we collapse that binary, it is understanding that individuals have these multiple different identities that cannot be checked off in the boxes that we have created. And secondly, society has always had this spectrum. It's just that to order society, we have created these binaries. There were Supreme Court rulings because the Supreme Court said, well, if you're not this, you must be this. And we have no time for this middle. And if you look at the Supreme Court today, now we have our first Latina, but we don't have an API person. We don't have a mixed race person. So you're looking at a court that was all white, trying to decide what the country looks like and who can be seen and who is invisible.
So it's almost like the U.S. has been a very black and white, no pun intended, culture where either this or that, and there's no middle ground.
Yes.
And you're saying there obviously is a middle ground.
Always has been.
Yeah.
There's a reality that has always existed that is much more diverse. Not inclusive, diverse, which is a huge distinction, right? But there have been many more identities in reality in the United States, whether it's race or gender or sexuality, certainly class, which is another thing we don't talk about, than our construct of ourselves has allowed, and certainly legally that has been allowed. Typically, we've seen the gay rights movement move swiftly along for gays and lesbians, but not for trans people. Because that's an identity that fits outside of that binary, literally. And people are very uncomfortable.
And so, if I'm understanding you right, one of your messages for our viewers today is to be more cognizant that there is a middle ground, that not everybody fits all the way over here, or into these boxes that we have typically put people in.
Yes, and many of you are those people who don't fit in those boxes. It's a little bit of self-examination. There are very few Americans that neatly fit, some, but into binary boxes, right? You can have a cisgender, straight, white man. That's tick, 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 tick. But most people are not that.
Yeah.
In the United States, we have taken the descendants of 60% of the world's population and have said, now y'all are one people. In a way that is bizarre, right? Groups of people who have literally nothing in common in Asia or the Pacific Islands are now part of one group. And when this developed in the 1960s, it came out of the civil rights movement. And it was important, it's still important right now, for an API community to exist because of scale. These are very small groups historically in the United States, so there was an intentional effort to bring them under one umbrella. And in many ways, they were defined by the fact that as large as Asia Pacific is, this is where their ancestors were from. And in the United States, they were kind of the third wheel in this binary system, right? Filipinos have been in the United States since the 16th century on the West Coast. Before America, they were API people. So one of the challenges is being part of my identity that you don't see as your primary identity and the rest of the country doesn't know about. So I don't walk around saying I am an API person. Professionally, I'm an API person, but personally, I'm Guyanese, I'm Caribbean, I'm mixed race, I'm all these different things. I'm Desi, I'm South Asian. So the first difficulty is that you're part of a mix of folks that has been, I wouldn't say imposed upon you, but yeah.
So, quick follow-up question on that, if that's okay, because I appreciate you educating all of us on this today. What's the solution there?
So at Encapia and within the larger API movement, we talk a lot about data disaggregation.
You're using all these amazing big terms that I knew nothing about before today.
So when it comes to data, we're trying to get agencies in the federal government to break down data into categories that are not just, let's just start with other, right? API folks have always been put into other. Let's break that down to API, and then if we can, let's break that down to South Asian, East Asian, Pacific Islanders. Because, for example, Asian Americans are an immigrant descended group. Pacific Islanders are not. Asian Americans came to the United States. America came to the Pacific Islands. So when you say, well, the descendants of Indians or descendants of Chinese folks in America, that's a history of people traveling to continental United States or its territories. When you talk about Guam, American Samoa, Hawaii, that was America going there. So that's an entire different legacy. And when it comes to the LGBTQ part, I think one of the difficulties that many folks have is not being seen. There are incredibly entrenched stereotypes of what API folks are. They tend to be very specifically East Asian, because in the United States, studies have shown that anytime a non-Asian American is asked, what is an Asian person? They think Chinese, Korean, Vietnamese, or Japanese. Coincidentally, all the countries the United States has been in some sort of war with. So this is how America has framed its interaction, right? It has been at war with these countries.
So you mentioned Pacific Islander a
Yes.
second ago. Just for my own knowledge, and maybe for others who are watching today,
Yes.
what are some of the main Pacific Island countries, or the main countries that Pacific Islander person is from?
Sure. So the Pacific Islands, when we say Pacific Islands, the United States, in this context, we exclude white populations in Australia and New Zealand, although the populations of Australia and New Zealand account for the vast majority of the population of the Pacific world, or Pacifica, as it's called in certain Pacific communities. But Hawaii is a Pacific nation. In the United States, we have territories remaining in American Samoa, Guam, and the Northern Mariana Islands. We've had historical relationships with the Federated States of Micronesia, Palau, and we do also have significant populations in the United States of people from Tonga and a few other parts, but particularly Tonga because of the Mormon connection. So there's a large Tongan population on the West Coast and in Utah.
My gosh, I have so much to learn. Well, this is all fantastic and very helpful. What is the acronym for your organization again?
NCAPIA.
NCAPIA.
NQAPIA.
Okay, and tell us one last time what it stands for again.
The National Queer Asian Pacific Islander Alliance.
Okay, got it. So what inspired you to start NCAPIA?
So I will say what inspired me to become executive director.
Yes, sorry, thank you.
So I think for several reasons, but I think the most important one is this is what I've always done in my career. I've always worked on equity and equality issues, particularly for BIPOC communities. I'm
BIPOC.
Yes.
Tell us what that means too.
Black, Indigenous, and other people of color.
Got it. Okay.
It's a new term for me as well, so it's a new term for y'all. I've been doing this for 20 years, so I'm from POC, from when it was people of color, and it will change because the acronym BIPOC is also not as inclusive as it should be. So that will change in time, but now that is the terminology of the movement. But NCAPIA was an opportunity to combine my identity with my work. And yes, I've had incredible privilege of doing that in multiple spaces because I'm a person of color, I'm BIPOC, I'm LGBTQ, but this was the first time there was a specific organization.
And that gives me chills, and it seems like a perfect alignment for everything that you've done and all the many aspects of who you are. So obviously our show is Real Talk on Racism. Mm-hmm. What is an example of racism that you personally have experienced?
So I think we need to talk about racism in many ways, but particularly in this moment with Trump, and I don't want to get into Trump too much, but I think many people think the Trump administration has increased racism in the country, or it has allowed racists to come out of the closet. Very true. But what Trump has also done is stunted the conversation. He's brought it down to a level of epithets and slurs and individual forms of racism. Whereas before Trump, we had been making good headway in institutional racism. So now we're back at the point where somebody says, well, I'm not racist because I don't use the N-word. And everybody applauds. Because we are now in a society where if somebody uses the N-word, people will also applaud. We had kind of moved forward to talk about racism in America will continue even if everybody stops being individually racist. Because the systems are inherently racist, right? So when I think of my encounters with racism, yes, I've been called names, I've been called slurs, I have been asked, questions about, well, where are you really from? I've had a funder say to me recently, but wait, you don't look Asian. And these are what we call the microaggressions. And people sometimes hear the word microaggression and they think, well, this is a minor thing, right? This is something that somebody said and you can take it the wrong way. But when that piles up, it's similar to someone making a pass at you and making it pass at you to the point where you don't want to go to that place because it becomes uncomfortable. That's what a series of microaggressions happens to you when you're at work, for example. Like, it may seem small, but those questions pile up because one time is a nuisance, multiple times it's how people see you. So we have that, but then we also have the systemic issues. So, for example, in the workplace scenario, one would be the microaggression of somebody asking you those questions, or you don't look that way, or this is not who we expected, or your name doesn't match your face, versus somebody firing you because they don't like black people. That's an institutional form of racism, because they will never say, I don't like black people, but they tend to be in a position of power. I always say this. It's not the people who are at the KKK rallies or the Proud Boy rallies. It's Amber and HR. Say, oh yeah, you don't fit. That is the institutional gatekeepers that when you have 1 million of them across the country, and that to me is the work that I'm doing. And if you say what have I experienced personally? Ultimately, I know I will die being unequal in this country. I will die being seen as less than you.
That's terrible.
All ways. And there is nothing. It can get better. I will make less money. I will be more likely to have different diseases. I will be more likely to be accosted by police officers. My outcomes are structured in a way that, do I believe in my lifetime we will overcome that? No. And this is the thing, right? Like, you are not a racist person. Obviously.
Thank you.
And I know you, right? You don't have a racist framework in the world, but the world that you live in has created a system of outcomes that will benefit you more than it'll benefit me. And that's not just me, that's women, that's black women, that's black trans women. As we go through the multiple marginalizations, that distance from equity lengthens, and ultimately that is the systemic issues. And I am so hopeful that we can put the genie of the individual racism back in the bottle, and then we can go back to talking about these systems, right? These things that, for example, the political systems that privilege rural states with large white populations. That is where the conversation needs to happen, not the person who goes on a racist rant, although they need to be dealt with too. Yeah.
Got it. Okay, so it's separate paths, if you will, the individual racism and the systemic racism, and we should be on both paths simultaneously, which, hopefully shows like this help to educate people, certainly on the individual racism side and what we can do differently, and on education about the systemic racism side, which I know is a lot harder to solve.
It is much harder.
We have about 2 minutes left, which it's crazy. Time flies when you're talking about an important topic. What's the number one thing that people watching today can do to help reduce or hopefully eliminate racism?
I would say the number one thing that you can do is learn. I'm amazed. Like, I didn't have Google growing up. I was part of that generation that really believed that having this information superhighway, as they called it, would make people smarter, and it has not, right? It has made people meaner. I wouldn't say worse, but meaner. Look into information, right? If you want to learn more about Pacific Islanders, there's tons of information out there. And you don't have to be a social justice warrior. I don't consider myself a social justice warrior. If you ask me, I'm not freeing or liberating anybody. I'm doing a job that hopefully helps to bring people closer to equality. And I think people sitting at home who don't run a nonprofit or are not at protests because that's not your thing, you're always looking for ways, hopefully you're looking for ways to make a difference. And that could be learning about people so you ask the right questions. That could be checking your stereotypes. It could be something as important as mentorship or volunteering, learning about a different group of people, learning about their experiences, but most of all, reading. Like going back to Googling what is happening, credible sources, not the misinformation, not YouTube videos, but actual information that gives you a better understanding of what's happening in the world. And you will learn things like, there's not an army trying to impose critical race theory. Kimberly Crenshaw is not trying to take over schools. This is not what is really happening in the country. And if you don't do your own research, you can quickly slide into these different silos. And I think somebody going about their business, how you implement that information can actually do a lot. You don't have to run a nonprofit. You can give your time, you can give your money, you can give some of your sweat equity, which is like, for example, mentoring. If you're in HR, look for candidates outside of the pool that comes to you. This is critically important to getting people their first jobs. Something as simple as that. I don't need you to be at a protest. I don't need you to make a sign. I need you to step out of your company's recruiting processes and hire more diverse candidates. That will make much more difference than you coming to a die-in.
Wow, well, thank you, Kenrick Ross. So many excellent points today. Grateful to have you here on Real Talk on Racism. Thank you, our viewers, for watching. Thanks to Nick and Jim behind the scenes. For everybody here at Princeton TV and Real Talk on Racism, I'm Russ Terry. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.